Hello and good afternoon. I'm Gary Sundermeyer with Bayshore Recycling, and on behalf of my co-chair in climate, Martha Maxwell Doyle from the Barnegat Bay Partnership, I'd like to welcome you all here this afternoon for our discussion of advancing climate change, a case study in Providence, Rhode Island. We have really outstanding turnout once again. Today we have 400 registered in round numbers. So thank you very much for tuning in to participate today. For those who might not be familiar with the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance, we are a statewide network of about 60 diverse organizations. We've been working for about 10 years and are committed to advancing evidence-based, nonpartisan climate change strategies at the state and local levels in New Jersey. We work across very broad sectors and have produced more than 50 reports in the 10 years that we've been in existence on such things as what people, places, and assets are most vulnerable to climate change and why, and the identification of policy options, best practices, and climate projections for the state of New Jersey. We provide accessible communication materials at convenings like today, and we've spearheaded the development of decision support tools. And I always like to point out, because they're my favorites, NJ Adapt and the New Jersey Flood Mapper, which I think is just such an extraordinarily valuable tool to demonstrate impacts of sea level rise through inundation mapping. We're very, very grateful to Rutgers University, who's been at the foundation of the Climate Alliance since day one, and for our facilitators, Jean Herb and Marjorie Kaplan, who are literally the heart and soul and the backbone of the Climate Alliance effort. One of the most important things I get to do today is to thank our 7 sponsors for today's event, and they are the Energy Foundation, PSEG, Bayshore Recycling, NJM Insurance Group, the New Jersey Clean Energy Program, Colliers Engineering and Design, and the New Jersey Conservation Foundation. Today's event is really the 6th in the series that we've started back in the fall in September. In lieu of an annual conference like anyone else with the pandemic, we've had to go to virtual programming. And again, this is our sixth event, and our theme throughout has been New Jersey leading the way on climate change solutions. All the prior sessions were recorded and they were available to our website. We're going to put that link into the chat box. And of course, today's program will also be recorded and you'll be able to access it afterward. And of course, throughout the discussion today, please type your questions into the chat box. We very strongly encourage that, and we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can in the Q&A session. So without further ado, we are absolutely delighted to welcome 3 colleagues from one of the oldest towns in the United States, dating back to 1636, and the 3rd most populous city in New England, Providence, the capital city of Rhode Island. Each of our speakers have played a key role in the development of a very progressive and forward-thinking climate justice plan for Providence. And we're first going to hear from Leah Bamberger, Providence's Sustainability Director, who's going to go through a PowerPoint and kind of give us a tour of the plan and how it was developed. And we're going to also hear from Jazandra, Baros, and Jesus Holguin, who are members of the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. So I'll just give a little more background if I can for Leah. She's been Providence's Director of Sustainability since 2015. Before that, she managed the City of Boston's citywide sustainability initiative and led the development of Boston's 2014 Climate Action Plan. And before that, she worked in various positions at the local and regional government level and with nonprofit organizations in the Northeast supporting their climate and sustainability efforts. Leah is a graduate of the College of Charleston and holds a master's in regional planning from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Jazandra Baros is a community outreach coordinator for the Southside Community Land Trust, and will be joining in the discussion throughout and sharing her experiences. And finally, Jesus Holguin is co-founding member of the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee, a community organizer, and Center for Coordinator for Youth Pride Incorporated. And how cool is this? In 2018, Jesus was chosen as the face of Rhode Island. I mean, is that awesome or what? That is such a cool distinction. And this year, Jesus was chosen to be champion of Pride for the Advocate magazine. So once again, we are so delighted to have the three of you join us today. We're so interested in what you're going to present to us. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Leah. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thanks everyone for having us here today. I'm going to get my slides, our slides. I'm going to share our screen. But in the meantime, Jazandra or Jesus, do you want to just provide any more context to your introduction and your involvement with this work?
Yeah, I don't mind starting that off. Hi, y'all again. My name is Jesus Holguin. My pronouns are they, them, or eje, or anything as long as there's not a negative intent. And I am a co-founder of the REJC, the Racial Environmental Justice Committee. I now serve as a committee member and a project team member, which just means I'm more involved in the day-to-day work of REJC. I think just some of like what I try to do as a Providence community member is create holistic safe spaces. And when I say holistic safe spaces, I'm really talking about you know, folks having access to clean spaces and clean air, clean good food, clean water, not being policed for their skin color or who they love or what they wear or how they present themselves. And so I think that I'll just add that little piece from me, and whoever wants to take it next, I'll give it to y'all.
Jesus. So I'm Jazandra Baros, and I am a member of the Race and Environmental Justice Committee, and I'm also serving currently as the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Southside Community Land Trust. All of this work is pretty new to me, but I am a Providence native, and I grew up here and came back to Rhode Island in 2016 after living in Charlotte, North Carolina for almost a decade, and doing very different work, working in the food industry, and then coming and beginning to get acclimated to what was happening in my community and finding work, doing work around urban agriculture. And just really having a different view of like disparities in my community and really having an understanding of kind of the systemic nature of those things, and really wanting to get involved in a way that, you know, felt more holistic, besides kind of just being a person, you know, doing a job, but really being connected to, right, those everyday needs of folks in my communities and the things that we're facing. And so that's kind of how I've gotten to this work. I'm new to it, and so I'm still learning, and I'm really grateful to be in community with folks who have been doing this work for a long time in the city. So yeah, glad to be here.
Thank you. I will jump into the presentation and kind of talk a little bit about how I came into this work. Okay, so as was mentioned, I joined the city of Providence in 2015, and it was a new administration that had taken office. Mayor Jorge Alorza took office the beginning of that year. I joined in the spring and was really starting to get to know the community and the work here. I'm from Massachusetts in the Boston area originally. So I knew Providence, but I didn't know it in the way that I needed to know it to do this work. And we had a sustainability plan that was released in 2014. And learning about that and that plan, as well as what I was hearing from community and just observing and absorbing as I got to know the city a bit more, there was definitely a neglect on environmental justice issues. There are great, as Jazandra was talking about, discrepancies in the city, and the sustainability plan really reflected sort of traditional white environmental types of goals and strategies around waste reduction and energy conservation. But what was really missing was some of the issues around, the pollution around the Port of Providence that is disproportionately burdening the surrounding low-income communities of color. And lead is a serious issue that we'll talk about a little bit later. So I was doing some trainings that were offered by the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, these equity and sustainability trainings, and that was very helpful context to start what ultimately became a partnership with the Environmental Justice League of Rhode Island, which Jesus was affiliated with at the time, and among other colleagues there. So we, through that process, were able to secure a grant through a match from a local foundation through the Partners for Places program and the Funders Network to think about how initially we were proposing to incorporate equity into our sustainability plan. And it sort of just took a life of its own from there. But what was really important was having that funding to support the work and having a partnership, a community partner, that's Frontline Community Organization that was with us from the very beginning to co-create the work from the start. And just a little bit of background about Providence. I think there's a really interesting connection between Providence and being the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, which is really has generated an immense amount of wealth for white settlers and colonists in the city, transformed the landscape, and we're really dealing with a lot of that legacy still today. Of course, I mentioned the Port of Providence, and we have these old mill buildings, some of which are being reused, some of which are still a challenge. So the impact of this is significant in Providence, and it's really an exciting place to do the work because we're kind of acknowledging that history and the history of the slave trade. And Providence in the Northeast was all about textiles, and that cotton was coming from extracted slave labor from the South. And it is this industrialization and this extraction that has created the climate crisis that we're addressing today. And so we're trying to really address all of those things together and not just isolate climate change from the processes that enabled climate change to be the problem that it is today. So as I mentioned, or Jesus or Jazandra, do you want to jump in on talking about the impacts, elaborate on some of those discrepancies and impacts that we're dealing with here?
Yeah, no, I think usually when we look at toxic sites and where they're placed is usually in predominantly places where Black and brown folks live, poor Black and brown folks specifically. And so it's specifically in Providence. If you look at that line of like the gradient of orange, red, and yellow, and follow it through, usually along those edges, it's Black and brown communities that live there, while also you usually see that there's like, that's where the highway cuts through. That's also where there's a train track that comes through, where like they call them bomber trains in Massachusetts that like carry fuel through communities. And then there's also like the sites by the port where they just have a bunch of chemicals and toxic things that like constantly spew into the community, and then just like the overlap of all of those things like get into this piece of like an environmental like racist community.
Yeah, and we have, I didn't include them here because of time, but there's, it's things like lead poisoning rates among kindergarten age students. We have in some neighborhoods over 30% of kindergartners have elevated lead levels. That's unacceptable. Tree canopy discrepancies, toxic sites, as Jesus mentioned. So these are all the sort of layering factors that are incorporated into this.
This is me, right? Yeah, okay. And I think Leah mentioned it earlier before they got into the history of like, it took a life of its own, what we started doing. And so I think it was important that we had community in this space. So like Leah said, I was a part of the Environmental Justice League. And so we had a base of folks that we would connect to and organize with, that were folks who were making real changes in the city. And we had talked to them about, hey, like we have this opportunity to impact policy and like, right. And so folks in the space got very like wary because they were like, I don't want to be pacified by the city or be use my capacity when I could be outside of this room actually creating change, and not just like be a box that the city checked that they're doing like some kind of work that's equitable. And so a part of that was really building the trust with between the community and the city just around what we're trying to do. And so through that, we were able to, come up with like our community. Through that, we had to come up with our community norms. A lot of that was really centering the folks that were most affected by the issues, making sure that we had a women of color centered space, and doing a bunch of things like that to just create a space where we can have the conversation of like, what does it look like? What would this look like if we were to work with the city? And out of that really just came a piece of recognizing the harm. And like the community was like, if the city could recognize the harm, we can actually work with them to say like, all right, this is what we're trying to do. And like through that, we brought the Undoing Racism training to Providence, just so the city went through. And for me personally, I think that was a really big point for me, because I was hearing like the folks in my community be like, we don't want to do this because we don't want to be pacified. And then I got to see like the mayor come in for this 3-day meeting, and like sit through it and like actively participate. And I'm really like, I really watch the mayors in the spaces when they're in the spaces, because I love the like, oh, hey, how you doing? Hey, how you doing? I'm like, do you remember me? Like, we already met like 3-4 times. My mayor remembers me, but it was cool for me to like witness him not like ducking out of the event, like just as like to show face. And so I truly appreciated that piece at the beginning. And like, that's what really continued. Building that trust is really what continued to let the work flourish.
Yeah, the Undoing Racism trainings were, just to build on what Jesus was saying, were really important to the beginning of the process to establish, to build that trust and to establish that shared analysis of systemic racism. And this work is not about just increasing or improving outcomes for people of color in the city. This is really about changing the systems and reforming the systems in ways that are going, to get at those root causes of these problems. So we're talking about, solving this problem upstream, not at the end where the challenges are. It's not about creating new programs or, for community members, for people of color. It's really about tweaking the structure so we have a form of government that isn't oppressive and isn't perpetuating these inequities. And it continues to be important. Jazandra, I don't know if you want to talk at all about, you joined an Undoing Racism training. We hold them as much as we can as folks kind of join and get involved. So it is really important, an ongoing effort to ensure that as the work grows, that we're continuing to have that shared analysis and understanding.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what it really comes down to, is just being able to like, one, have a shared understanding and analysis of the root issues, and then being able to build with each other from that. I mean, we recently, as a part of a project we're working on through the climate justice plan, we did another Undoing Racism training for the cohort of folks we're working with, community members, but also people from Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. And as you know, that is like a principle that we have in the REJC, that if you're doing work with us, you have to go through this training, because we need to have a shared analysis so that we can come up with solutions together. But we can't do that if we're not able to name and like identify those root issues.
Mhm.
All right, Jesus, we'll turn it back to you to talk about the framework.
Yeah. And I think really that was really it, getting that shared understanding. And so really being able to create, we created this with the city, with Leah and community. We created the Just Providence framework, which really came out of like the way that we work and like our norms and principles that like are ancestral to like just folks, Black and brown folks who organize, and like really just came together to really talk about of like what does these principles really look like in real life, and like went through the process of like defining that and making sure that like our story is told when we can hand this document over, because we had a part of it was the acknowledgements, right, and acknowledging that the city has had harmful like was founded with historically like racially charged like policies and like attacking poorness and different things like that. And so really, and even like colonization and like moving folks off their lands and whatever. So like really like talking about all of that so that we can come to this place of really having an understanding of like, what does this look like? What does VNBB look like when we talk about we want good living? How do we write that and say that so that no one can misinterpret it? And it took like years, like it took like almost like a year and a half, 2 years of us just talking about wording and how we worded things and how we framed it so that we can say what we want to say without compromising like our values and our principles. And I think that's really where the framework came from. And after working with the city of like with Leah, who is the head of the Office of Sustainability, we still had to present this piece of document that we have worked on to another body inside of the Office of Sustainability, and it was predominantly white. Well, no, it was all white. I guess I'll say predominantly white. I don't know how people identify all the times. And we had to present this thing that we've been working on to this body of folks for the Office of Sustainability to be able to adopt it, so that we can like move forward with our work and make sure that like our work is being impactful. And we didn't want to do it, but we were like, we got to go through this is the process right now, right? But like, this is like us working with the city. And we're like, this is the work.
And also, Jesus, just to add, the Environmental Sustainability Task Force had been, they acknowledged that they needed to address, they weren't reflective of the community. They were very supportive of the work, the equity work that we were doing with the Racial Environmental Justice Committee. And I kept them informed. And I essentially chose to bring this before them so they had an opportunity to really engage with the framework and officially adopt it. And you can see in the photo, the mayor there sitting at the front of the table, and the REJC is presenting their framework. So continue, Jesus.
Right. So now we've done we do this work. This is the work that we're doing. And so now we have to present to this body that actually has power, right? Because at first we're just a community of folks meeting together. And so while we're presenting it, like folks are like, well, I didn't get to read it, so like I don't really know. And so they were like, can we get 2 weeks to read it? And we're like, we've been working on this for 2 years with the Office of Sustainability. Like, whether you pass it here or not, this work is gonna continue because it's the work that we do, and it's the work that needs to happen. And still, it was like, we still need to read this. And it was another moment of like that piece of when we're working with the city, how like our capacity can be taken, and then like we want to create this impact, and then we have to present our work to this body, and this body says no. And so now this capacity that we wasted trying to build this connection with the city and community is like, this is why we don't do this, right? This is why it was so hard to even get to this point. And so, yeah, I Leah, if you wanna.
Yeah, it was an embarrassing moment for me. I certainly felt like I was surprised that there was pushback, and ultimately they did pass it and approve it. But it was very interesting to see, you know, a group of folks who are progressive and think of themselves as very forward thinking and supportive of equity. But when it comes to seeing it on paper and like seeing those acknowledgements, there was a struggle there for that to really be internalized and supported by the group. But ultimately they did support it, and it was a really important step, I think. Even though it was a struggle to get their buy-in and support, I'm really glad that we went before them, and it was a learning moment, and I think a big barrier that we overcame.
I think I'll just because Monica isn't here, I'll uplift something she said during the meeting, and it was like, if you don't pass this, we're gonna come for your seats as community members, and then we'll pass it if you're not gonna pass it. And so, you know, and through all that, like, you know, building trust and, you know, struggling together, you know, now there are REJC specific seats on the environmental task force, which, you know, just on the process of like moving things forward.
Absolutely. So once we had that behind us, we were, all right, we have this great framework. We were looking for a way to apply it and say, like, let's use this to evaluate some policies and to like really incorporate into our decision-making process. So we, a member of the city council was, had been reaching out to me and was interested in doing a plastic bag ban. And so we said, great, we'll use the framework, let the REJC, which is essentially our accountability partner in this work. So, you know, I could take the framework and say, and read it and like turn it into a checklist and say, yes, like this seems equitable, but it really takes the community members with the lived experience to understand, like, how is this actually going to impact their community? So that accountability is really, really important. So they were working on the research. There was seemingly no rush, but then all of a sudden the policy was being introduced and it was moving forward through the council. And in fact, it had actually, in Providence, it needs to pass city council twice for it to become a law, and it had passed the first time. But at that point, the REJC, and Jesus, you can kind of talk about the research that you all did and the process that you went to and the letter.
Right. I think, like Leah said, you know, thinking about how we will develop like this, like framework to, you know, put policies through to actually be able to do that with our knowledge and all that. With this initial policy, we started with doing research on just like how has this policy looked like in other places in the US. And very quickly we found that like just in Chicago in like a quick 4 to 6 months, they made like over $2 million off of like their poorest neighborhoods. And so really like seeing that, we were like, oh, whoa, this really can't pass. And really like, again, getting to that piece of like, what does Buen Vivir look like, and using our framework and our principles. You know, we came up with like the racial equity tool, which just allows us to like put these policies through through this tool to just see what is the actual impact, who's being impacted, how is the community benefiting from this. And so, yeah, it was really cool process to just go through and be like, look, this is like, you can see that this is not going to help the community. And then that was after that was first introduced. Right, the mayor said no to it. Then, we did the work, figured out how we can pass it.
Yeah,
really.
well, so it passed city council, but then the RJC sent the letter saying we don't believe this policy is racially equitable, and the mayor actually vetoed it.
Yeah. Yes. And so, like, yeah, and that was another place where, like, I'm watching you, mayor. That it's like, because when you have that power, right, it really sets if you live in the culture that you're trying to set, it really sets the like paradigm to like keep moving forward. And so through them being able to veto it, we then was able to work with folks to actually come up with the process of like, how do we make this equitable? How do we, like, because we don't like plastic bag. I see the videos of like the turtles in the ocean and I'd be like, oh my God, like the plastic island. And so we don't want plastic bags, but also we recognize that like that tax on the fee on the bag that someone just sees as 10 cents is actually a fee that like is detrimental to a family who like needs to move around. And then I think talking, then just really seeing how can we do this in an equitable way and like not charge a fee to the folks, to the poorest folks, right? And maybe we move it out. And then we talked about a bunch of different ways and finally it passed without a fee. And we all like rejoiced.
Yeah, and that really was an important moment of accountability again. Is the city going to hold true and uphold, hold true in its commitment to the RJC to really honor their expertise and their ability to know what's best for their community, or are we going to stick with the status quo and go with what the environmental orgs were pushing for and a lot of the policy and decision makers? The council approved this. It's very rare for the mayor to actually veto something that was passed unanimously by city council. So from there, sorry, Jazandra, did you want to add anything?
I don't have anything to add. I just was wanting to respond to something in the chat, but I'll hold it back. But just that just to clarify that the way the original plastic bag ban was written was that it was going to have a fee, and that it was inequitable to have that fee, especially if it was going to be low income communities that were going to be feeling the brunt of that fee.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So again, we're just sort of telling you the story of the work, and what came next is that we received a grant. So previously the mayor had set a goal to become carbon neutral by 2015. We've been focusing really on this equity work, and it was a really important first step to get to the climate work. And so we got a grant to create a climate action plan with an equity lens, and we continue to partner with the RJC to really lead that engagement process and help us continue to center use the Just Providence framework and center the decision-making process around those who are most impacted. So we had a very different process that, Jesus, I'll let you talk about.
This is like the energy trainings, right? Yes.
Yep.
So it initially started with us because the climate action plan was talking about electricity and like metrics that I guess that we wasn't like there yet with understanding. and just how like energy was distributed and where it was like how like, and so I think from that we just went through a lot of like processes where we mapped out like how does our electricity get to our house. And it was really cool, it was really fun, it was like room size and a bunch of Legos and toys. It was a really fun experience. And through that process, you know, we were able to really determine, oh wow, so our energy, like what happens here in Providence really impacts what happens everywhere else. Like what happens in our port when we store things there, it really impacts everything everywhere else. And you know, learning that like our energy comes from like Philly and like different things like that, I think that was really cool. And I think outside of that was really learning. Then we just started seeing and asking our community like simple questions, right? Like it was really simple questions around like, how do you stay cool in the, how do you stay cool in the summer? How do you stay warm in the winter? I wanted to say it the right way. And really just getting to those points of like simple things of how do you control the space that you're in and like keep it comfortable for yourself. And I think through those questions we were able to really get to the like priorities of what folks saw and needed in their communities. And then yeah, we were able to put it all together and make it pretty.
Absolutely, yeah. So we really, I think we flipped the process on its head. So we did very intentional engagement with frontline communities. My job was to keep people informed who were outside of that process, so traditional environmental groups, and the mayor's office, and my colleagues in City Hall, and to really make sure that the power of what got in the plan really sat with the community members who were most impacted. And there was a lot of back and forth. And there was, you know, we had to make some compromises along the way, but carving out that space of what we agreed on. And I think if you look in the plan, you'll notice that there's a lot in there that isn't in most climate action plans, right? We talk about ending utility shutoffs. We talk about making sure energy is affordable. We talk about housing and anti-gentrification, and that's based on, you know, a lot of what we heard from community members. Things like, you know, just clean air around the port, a huge priority. It's also right where 95 goes through. So instead of prioritizing sort of the low-hanging fruit emissions, like transportation, I-95, that's not something that we have a lot of authority over to change. And so typically cities tend to focus on, you know, building energy efficiency and things that they have a little bit more jurisdiction over. But we're trying to prioritize emission reductions that are also going to have community health implications as well. And so I think that's another distinguishing characteristic of our plan, is really that the public health and community health prioritization in our process. And there was pushback. Presenting to the traditional white environmental community, they were upset that they weren't really involved in the process. They wanted to have more of a say in that. And it was really, again, going back to those undoing racism trainings. There are actually some folks that are here with us today who participated and were able to speak up in those meetings and say, and really defend the process, because they understood, they had that analysis and they were allies in the work. Even though they weren't involved, they understood that their role was to amplify and support the folks who were centered in this process. So the plan was released in 2019. We had a great celebration with community. And one of the things that I would definitely encourage you to take a listen to on our website is the future stories. So when we were done with the plan, and we had all of these strategies and actions, we needed a way to communicate them back to the folks who were involved in the process, the folks who were interviewed and their communities. And the REJC came up with these beautiful stories that incorporated the policies and the work in the plan, but brought them to life in a way to show how Providence, and specifically how their communities, would be different if this plan moved forward. They're available in Spanish and English. And again, I highly encourage you to take a listen to those. So the plan's released, we're all celebrating, and then I started to hear whisperings in the planning department and the mayor's office about this waste transfer station that's they might be putting in an application for a development in South Providence, which is the Port neighborhood, which is our frontline communities. It's like the centerpiece of the climate justice plan is to improve pollution and the community around this area. And a waste transfer station is going to bring more traffic, more pollution, more unwanted land uses to this already overburdened neighborhood. And so I'm thinking, oh great, we're all out here celebrating, and on top of it, the planning department said, our zoning code, there's really nothing in this zoning that's going to give us legal standing to stop this development. So I'm thinking, and at this point, what is this, 4 years of work and relationship building, and I'm like, this is all going to come crashing down because this facility is probably going to get approved, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. But I was very pleased, with the first meeting or conversation I had with the mayor's office about it, I heard, well, we have to figure out a way to stop this because we just released the climate justice plan. And I was such a relief. I mean, it wasn't a done deal, but in fact, they were able to find a loophole, and it was denied, which was a great relief. And again, really shows the power shift. And it's not even, I think what's important too is, certainly there's policy changes that need to happen, and we're still working on those. We need to change our zoning. We need to update our comprehensive plan. We need to institutionalize this plan. But there has already been a culture shift within the organization, which is almost, if not as strong or stronger than the policy changes, right? Government makes decisions. There's a lot of gray area in our bureaucracy, and government has the ability to use their power in different ways, still within the framework of the law and of the policies on the books. So it's a really great example of how that shift is happening on a sort of institutional, cultural level. And there's, I forgot I had a slide about this. We're still working on those policy changes that need to happen. But it was a really important moment. And Jesus, Jazandra, I don't know if you want to comment or add anything on that.
I would just say that it just exemplifies, right, like the need to have that that inside outside strategy, and to have folks who are supportive on both ends to really make those changes happen. And that is really what we are trying to just move forward, with the plan, and with getting it actually institutionalized, so that no matter what what mayor, who's sitting in city council, that we have this and that we can actually put it into action at this point.
Yeah, I ain't got nothing else to say. Y'all
Yeah.
said it. Great.
Great. So yeah, as I mentioned, we are working. There's a lot of work to do yet ahead to get this policy institutionalized into our comprehensive plan, changing the ordinances so that the next waste transfer station, regardless of the administration, doesn't get approved, and that we actually have a zoning code that supports that. There's a number of other initiatives that we're working on, but since we only have 10 more minutes, I'd love to open it up for questions at this time. So I will hand it off to Gary if you pop back, or.
Yeah, no, that's great. I want to thank you, Leah, Jesus, and Jazandra. That was terrific. And you expressed, hopefully we can learn from your experiences. And as you mentioned, Jesus, so much time, right? So much effort, but you've developed something that is actionable and being worked into the public policy making in Providence. And that's really what you want to get to that point. So congratulations on that. Jean's been monitoring the chat box, and there's lots and lots of questions. So I'm going to be quiet. Jean, take it away.
Yeah, there are lots of questions. What I'm going to do is bring in the questions that seem kind of broader and general, since we don't have tons of time to go through them, but that's all great. So there was one question, a couple questions that are related in terms of for the model that you have of community engagement, do you have thoughts on how that could be applied at a state level?
Yeah, it's something that we're working on through the green justice zones. And Jesus or Jazandra, would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I could share a little bit. So, I mean, it's really continuing the model that brought about the climate justice plan. And so it's working with a cohort of community folks, but it's also working with the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management and like bringing those community members, right, and like state agencies together, going through an undoing racism training together, so that we can figure out what is the action plan so that we can create these green justice zones. And so the green justice zones is coming directly out of the climate justice plan. And so like, how do we move that forward? How do we define these zones that have the zoning, right? Like the zoning, the policies behind them in order to stop folks who are polluting and coming in with these polluting industries, and you know, continuing to harm our communities. And so it's really, what is the ways that the communities can interact with state levels, and municipal levels, and how does that coordination happen between them? And so you know, our strategy is to always bring community folks to the table. So it's really about finding those ways to do that. Because
Thanks.
I can guarantee there's community folks who want to have a voice.
And,
Well, go ahead, Jesus, sorry.
Just to add on to that, I think what's really been helpful for that process is really us determining who our frontline community is and really getting to that core of like, these are the folks that we're trying to help, and then making sure that they're centered in the like overall conversation.
So related to that is a question, sort of recognizing that that your work and this kind of systematic change often involves community-based work, bottom up and top down in terms of government and finding that sweet spot. So the question is whether you've got any thoughts in terms of best practices or recommendations on finding that sweet spot and what that balance is that others who are participating today might be able to learn from.
Kind of what I just said with the frontline community.
Yeah.
I'll pass it off to Leah too.
Yeah, I think I would say, well, it's all hard. It's all really hard work, but getting started is particularly hard because you need to do this work in relationship and in authentic relationship. And that can be really hard for government to do. So it takes starting small, I think, is really important. So the REJC, we started with 10 community members. And a lot of the work, I mean, it's still happening in very small scale and small pockets, and you know, it will, you know, start to grow, especially with the green justice zone work that Jazandra talked about. But yeah, so I think starting small is important, and then making sure you're compensating community members for their time and their work. Always, even in this session, when the folks here reached out to me, and I made a point to want to include the community perspective as well, because I am not the face of this work. This really is work that was initiated and led by frontline community members in the REJC. So their perspective is really important when we talk about the work, and it's important that, you know, I'm here in my capacity and as a paid employee of the city, and community members don't have organizations or tax dollars that are supporting their time to talk about this work. So whenever, you know, these sorts of speaking engagements, I always make sure that and try to request that the community members get paid for their time. So thank you for that. So I think that's another important piece to getting started. Yeah, and you gotta just reach out and sorry, it's all about building relationships.
Thank you. Thanks all of you. So there's a question about what did you find effective in building bridges, if you built bridges, between the work that all of you were doing and the traditional white environmental community?
I'd say that like the way that we were able to like work, I feel like white environmentalists work from this urgency of like, we got to get it done now, like the world's gonna end now, and like, it's like, okay, but like or like the world's gonna like end by like 2040, 2030, 20, right? And so getting them to understand that like what we're trying to better is like everyday like life right now for like the folks who are frontline communities that we can affect, right? Versus like trying to build a better world for my kids. I'm like, I'm trying to live in a better world too. And so there's this piece of urgency when folks organize that like, you know, climate change is happening, but also like that urgency leads to people being left out of the conversation. And then like, you know, the people who are in the spaces get to be in the spaces, but folks who don't have access or can't make those spaces, and are the folks who are going to be impacted by the work, don't get a chance to be a part of that process. It just like, I don't know, it is important to like not let the urgency keep you from doing the intentional work that like you need to do to like, again, center the folks who are affected.
Thanks, Jesus.
And I just want to add to that, just the fact that like the urgency that folks may feel is like the impacts that our communities are already dealing with at this moment. So like what feels urgent for 2040 also feels really urgent for people who are like dealing with their kids being hospitalized for asthma rates that we know are directly connected to like the pollutants in the air. We're dealing with low tree coverage. And so we have ridiculous like, you know, ways to try to like figure out how to keep cool, you know, and people going through that. So I think that that sense of urgency has to be like looked at in relative to like the real time effects that people in frontline communities are experiencing.
Thank you. Was there anything in the original sustainability plan that was revised based on your work?
Not so. We published the climate justice plan, and which in a lot of ways it doesn't completely displace the sustainability plan, but given that that plan is, gosh, 7 years old at this point, our focus really is on the climate justice plan and moving that forward.
Okay. So I think I only have time for one more question, but it's a big one. So maybe each of you could give a shout out as to one of your biggest lessons learned from this work.
That's easy for me. You know, it came to Providence with, you know, some training and degrees and experience. And I think the biggest lesson for me was sort of in the vein of like, you don't know what you don't know. I learned so much from Jesus and Jazandra and other community partners, and trusting the process and like learning to trust to do something different in order to get different results. It sounds easy, but it's hard. It's really hard to do, especially in a position in government when you are really accountable to the public. So that was challenging.
Thanks, Leah. Jesus or Jazandra, any thoughts on this? Biggest lessons learned?
I mean, for me, my biggest lesson learned and learning is that like, as a community, we do have power. We do have the ability when we are able to come together and to organize. And when we have collaborators like folks like Leah and the Office of Sustainability, we are able to move forward and to progress in ways that are actually equitable.
And I think I'll just uplift one of our norms, which is like struggling together. Because you know, we're actively trying to create a system that like the system we now live in isn't really supportive of. So like we have to like struggle in that process, and with that trust, it comes with like that trust, because when people struggle, then it gets distrustful. And so really making sure we have that trust and struggling together, making sure that like, you know, we're working towards the same thing. And a lot of it, you know, is because we have that defined of like Gwen Vivid of like, what does that look like?
Thanks to all three of you for those inspiring answers. And I'm going to turn it over to Gary, but I will suggest that you take a minute before we close down to look at the chat box, because you have some amazing compliments in that chat box for the work that you've all done. So Gary, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And all I really want to say once again is thank you so much, Leah, Jesus, and Jazandra for your time today. As Jean was alluding to, we already had an hour, you know, and you've been dealing with this for 4 years, and you know, you've got so much more work that you want to do to accomplish change zoning ordinance, master plans, but you're so far along, you're so well on your way, but it doesn't end, as you know. And we can learn so much from you. We hope that in the future, you don't mind if we reach back to you to learn more from your experiences, because that's
right. We have lots of folks asking us to invite you back, so we'll stay in touch.
It's really, really important. So thank you again for your wonderful job that you've done, and best of luck as you continue to move forward. It's fabulous. It's great. So at this point, I want to thank all our participants for tuning in today. This ends our 6 webinar series for this year in lieu of our annual conference. In total, we had about 2,000 folks tune in to the 6 events. So that was really terrific. And to state the obvious, next year, we hope we do it live and in person, and we're beyond the pandemic. We can start to get back to normal and carry on, but in between, we'll keep the good work, going. So thank you to everyone. Please stay safe and be well. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.